No battle in all of American history showed more military genius and leadership failure. No battle in American history displayed a greater combination of Army maneuver and applied psychology than the May 1863 engagement at Chancellorsville. It was a fight that on paper General Robert E. Lee could not win. But he did win one of the Confederacy's most astonishing victories, though it came at an inestimable cost. With genuine pleasure, I welcome to this documentary a longtime friend, William C. Davis. Jack is now Director of Programs for the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies at Virginia Tech. He brings to this series an uncommon talent and wide experience. It is an honor to work with him. And we thank you, our viewers, in joining us now for Tragic Victory, the Battle of Chancellorsville.
Some years ago, a book appeared under the unlikely title, From the Jaws of Victory, the story of military blunders throughout the ages. The author dedicated the book to Ambrose Burnside, whom he called the worst general who ever lived. That may have been a bit of an exaggeration, but there's little in doubt that in his brief time in command of the Union's Army of the Potomac, poor Burnside bounced from catastrophe to catastrophe. It began for him in the Battle of Fredericksburg on December 13, 1862. Burnside had just replaced the popular but timid General George B. McClellan, who built the Army of the Potomac but was reluctant to use it. Burnside planned a rapid strike south to get between Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and the Confederate capital at Richmond, and at first it looked like he would succeed. But at Fredericksburg on the Rappahannock River, he was stopped by delay and indecision, giving Lee time to confront him on the heights behind the city. Burnside then senselessly battered his army against the Southerners' almost impregnable positions in what would be the largest battle of the war in numbers of men involved. In the end, after taking more than 12,000 casualties for nothing, Burnside retreated. 5 weeks later, Burnside tried another maneuver to get around Lee, only to get bogged down for 5 days as incessant rain turned the roads into such mire that it became known as Burnside's Mud March. Retreating in discouragement and disgrace, Burnside was relieved of command 2 days later. That brought an energetic and inspirational new general to command the demoralized Yankees, a man who had admittedly campaigned and even conspired to take Burnside's command. Yet he was also a man known as a fighter of supreme confidence, and he began by rebuilding the Army of the Potomac, ensuring that its arms and equipment were the best available, seeing to the comfort of the men even as he trained them for hard campaigning to come in the spring. There would be no more mistakes, no more hesitation and indecision. He promised that the next time this army marched against Lee, it would march to triumph.
President Abraham Lincoln had seen a lot of soldiers by this time, and sadly had seen a lot of defeat. As the Army of Potomac passed the winter and spring of 1863 in its quarters in and around Falmouth, across the Rappahannock from Fredericksburg, Lincoln came to its headquarters at Chatham, the beautiful home of the Lacey family. On April 6th and 8th, Lincoln reviewed almost 135,000 men in rank upon rank. He was an ungainly sight riding on horseback, yet the men cheered him everywhere he went. They all saw the anxiety in his face, the expectation, and the question, could they bring him a victory this time?
Robert E. Lee was the embodiment of Virginia's Cavalier tradition. A consummate soldier, he had declined command of all Union armies in 1861 because of his devotion to his native state. Lee had been in command of the Army of Northern Virginia for less than a year when he fought the Battle of Chancellorsville. However, in those 11 months, he had defeated McClellan's army at Richmond, Pope's army at Manassas, and Burnside's army at Fredericksburg. Lee had eclipsed every field commander the South had. Confederate soldiers looked at the gray-bearded, kindly Lee with affection sons give their fathers. Union General Joseph Hooker had connived and manipulated to get Army command. Both his assets and his defects were clearly visible. Beardless, blond, self-assured, Hooker was known as well for whiskey, women, and arrogance. He had taken command of the Army of the Potomac early in 1863, and he had given it new life. Hooker looked like a god for a Northern public hungry for a bold captain who could secure victory in Virginia. In the battle to come, Lee and Hooker never saw one another. And yet, perhaps more than in any other engagement of the Civil War, Chancellorsville would be a contest between two individuals. It would be a test of knowledge, integrity, manhood, and moral fiber. In such a confrontation, Joe Hooker was so outmatched that in the end, it was no contest at all.
Hooker was embarking on a 25-mile secret march with 70,000 soldiers, 40 pieces of artillery, and more than 100 fully loaded wagons. Every item of this huge force had to get on the southern side of a wide barrier, the Rappahannock River.
How to get an army across a river, especially a wide river, could be a logistical nightmare in the Civil War. Old pontoon bridges were available, but more often than not, the Army relied on fords, the shallow spots in a river. You see, unless all components of an army, infantry, artillery, cavalry, supply wagons, ambulance wagons, and the like, unless all components went across, no components went across. When Joseph Hooker inaugurated his Chancellorsville campaign late in April, he went about 20 miles up the Rappahannock River, and he crossed at such shallow points as Ely's Ford and U.S. Ford. Without those fords, getting that campaign underway would have been difficult indeed.
In January of 1863, the Union Army of the Potomac got a new commander in the person of General Joseph Hooker. Hooker took over command of the Army after the disastrous Mud March, in which the Union Army once again failed in its objective to cross the river and defeat Robert E. Lee. Hooker took command at a time when the Army was at its highest state of demoralization it would ever reach during the war. But in the course of about 3 months' time, Hooker took this demoralized rabble of men and whipped them into what he himself called the finest army of the planet. Hooker had about 135,000 men under his command. He decided to break this army into 3 different parts. His cavalry would act first. Under the lead of General George Stoneman, it would move upriver from Lee, cross behind Lee's left flank, and slash down behind Lee, cutting off Lee's communications and supplies with the capital at Richmond. At the same time, the right wing of the Army, under Hooker himself, would cross behind Stoneman and come down on Lee's left flank. While Lee was, at that point, worried about his front, which was being attacked by John Sedgwick, who would cross the river with the third part of Hooker's army directly below Fredericksburg. So if Hooker's plan worked, he would have one part of his army in front of Lee, one part behind Lee, and his cavalry in between. When Lee tried to retreat, the cavalry would be there to cut off his retreat while Hooker's army closed him from behind and crushed him. The plan worked to perfection. The Union Army crossed the river about 6 to 7 miles behind me on April the 30th and came down to Chancellorsville, a crossroads across the Orange Turnpike, which is the noisy highway you hear behind me, and massed at a place called Chancellorsville. There, on May 1st, Joe Hooker's right wing began to move out, slowly closing the vice of this trap that he'd created. However, at that point, Robert E. Lee did the unexpected. Instead of retreating like Hooker thought he would do, Lee instead boldly split his army, leaving a small portion at Fredericksburg to hold off Sedgwick, marched with the bulk of his army west toward Chancellorsville, met Hooker, and at that point, Joe Hooker lost his nerve, fell back to Chancellorsville, giving up the initiative to Robert E. Lee. From that point on, the course of the battle would be dictated by Lee, not by Hooker.
It had been a near miss for Robert E. Lee. Rare was the opponent who could steal a march on him. Yet Hooker's bold plan and swift execution had done just that. Since his victory over Burnside, Lee kept his army in winter quarters in and around Fredericksburg, waiting for spring and the Yankees' next move. His strength reduced to about 60,000, Lee knew he could hardly assume the offensive against an army more than twice his strength, and that left the initiative to the enemy. Yet Lee was never more dangerous than when in a tight place. Furthermore, he had the advantage of knowing the countryside, and he would have the benefit of interior lines. meaning that he could move regiments from one part of his line directly to another if necessary, while the Federals, with a much longer front and their Army units separated by some distance, had farther to go. But most of all, Lee had his own audacity. Against a self-confident commander like Fighting Joe Hooker, Lee's best chance lay in doing the unexpected, and that is just what he had done. For his part, Hooker had taken too much for granted, especially after the initial movements of his plan had worked so smoothly. Nevertheless, Sedgwick was strong enough to pose a real danger to Lee's remnant at Fredericksburg, and even though his advance had been halted at Chancellorsville, still, if Hooker could just hold his ground, Sedgwick might still push through Fredericksburg and advance against Lee's rear, and then possibly crush the Confederates between the two forces through sheer force of numbers. But until then, by halting his advance where he had, Hooker now condemned his men to fight in the most awful terrain faced by Army soldiers anywhere during the Civil War.
In Virginia, it is called the Wilderness. It is an area 12 miles long, 6 miles wide, and it lies silent and foreboding along the southern bank of the Rappahannock River. Second growth timber choke each other. Heavy underbrush grows in every direction. A stream appears out of somewhere and goes nowhere, and it leaves behind land that is swamp-like in texture. The whole area was such that one could not see 20 yards in any direction. In other words, it was an awful place for an army to be. On the night of May 1st, 1863, Generals Lee and Jackson met here at the intersection of two country roads deep in the wilderness. And by the light of a single fire, the two generals sat on empty cracker boxes to plan what became one of the most daring strategies in all of American military history. To tell us more about it is my good friend, A. Wilson Green.
Well, Bud, ironically, General Jackson predicted that the Union Army would retreat on the night of May 1st, speculating that Hooker's withdrawal from his advance that day indicated that he would end the campaign. But Lee argued no, that Hooker was going to stay, and the general's job would be to find a vulnerable spot in the Union line to launch their attack.
And General Jeb Stuart happened to ride up later in the evening with exactly that information.
Stuart was reconnoitering against the Union right flank and discovered that Hooker's right flank, the western part of his army, was in the air, not anchored on any natural or artificial obstacle. Once imbued with that information, Lee and Jackson then decided that they would assault that flank, and the job became to discover how to arrive there with a sufficiently powerful force to destroy that wing of the Union Army, but do so secretly on what would be a 12-mile march.
And the wilderness was ideally suited for this. The thick woods here would aid secrecy. The thick woods would prevent Union artillery from concentrating, and there were so few roads in here that Hooker's army is actually pinned down to these narrow little country lanes.
Not only did the Confederates have the advantage of the terrain in the wilderness, but they also had the advantage of fighting on familiar territory. General Jackson's chaplain, Reverend Beverly Tucker Lacey, had the Presbyterian Church in Fredericksburg prior to the war and was familiar with this part of Spotsylvania County. The generals also were aware of the owners of Catherine Furnace, the Welford family, the people who had built all these charcoal roads that would provide a secret access to Hooker's right flank.
The basic Confederate strategy was going to be what had worked so well over the past 11 months, Jackson doing a flank movement, with Lee coming in to deliver the hammer blow at the great opportunity. When Lee asked Jackson how many men he intended to take with him, the Army commander must have gulped when Jackson replied he would take his whole corps, 28,000 soldiers, which would leave Lee with about 14,000 men confronting Joe Hooker's 70,000. This was truly going to be Lee's biggest gamble of the Civil War, but because he was so hopelessly outnumbered and because his stakes were so high, he had no choice but to take an enormous risk. Lee and Jackson were an unnatural pair. The alliance was one of the Cavalier and the Roundhead, the dignified, gentlemanly, masterful Lee, in contrast to the stern, humorless Old Testament warrior Jackson. They were 17 years apart in age. Lee was a product of Tidewater aristocracy. Jackson was an orphan from the mountains of northwestern Virginia. Lee had graduated high at West Point and given 30 years of outstanding service to the Army. Jackson finished West Point by unwavering determination and has spent the decade before the Civil War as a plodding, odd professor at the Virginia Military Institute. Nevertheless, Lee and Jackson share two dominating qualities: aggressiveness in battle and an abiding faith in God. Lee once said of Jackson, "He is true, honest, and brave, and spares no exertion to accomplish his objective." Jackson was unusually superlative about Lee. "So great is my confidence in him that I am willing to follow him blindfolded." They came together in late June 1862 as a Union Army hammered at the gates of Richmond. Both men had shaky beginnings in their relationship. However, they quickly came to depend upon and to trust completely one another. In less than a year, they had forged what many historians call a model military partnership. Had it not been so short-lived, the course of American history might well have been different. Shortly before 8 a.m., Jackson started down the Catherine Furnace Road with 71 regiments and 21 batteries of artillery. He had ridden but a short distance when he spied General Lee standing by the road. Jackson rained little sorrow, saluted. Lee returned the salute. What the two men said was short and unknown. No one was around to hear it. But it was an unforgettable sight. The mountain orphan and the tidewater aristocrat. One the aggressor, the other the audacious. Soon Jackson pointed silently to the west, eyes ablaze. Lee nodded. The two men saluted. Jackson rode off. They would never see each other again.
The clearing behind me was slightly larger in 1863 than it is today, but at the far end of the clearing was located Hazel Grove, a high open plateau on which Union artillery was located. Those Federal gunners spotted Jackson's column as it marched past this clearing less than 1 hour after they departed from the bivouac location. So Jackson's flank march, dependent on secrecy for success, was discovered about 45 minutes after it began.
The base of the chimney behind me is all that's left of Catherine's Furnace today. Yet on May 2nd, 1863, in late morning and early afternoon, the furnace and all the area around it became a battleground. After Hooker discovered Jackson's march, the Union commander mistakenly concluded that Jackson was retreating. As the morning went by, however, General Daniel Sickles, commanding the Union Third Corps, requested permission to come down and make sure of this. Hooker finally granted permission for elements of the Third Corps to move down here to the Catherine Furnace area. What happened then, Will?
Sickles encountered the 23rd Georgia, which was a regiment Jackson had detached from the head of his column as a flank guard to protect the main Confederate column as it turned to the south here at Catherine Furnace. As Sickles engaged the 23rd Georgia, he also came under fire from a Mississippi brigade Lee had posted on the high ground on Sickles' left. This unexpected Confederate resistance prompted General Sickles to ask for reinforcements. And before all was said and done, 20,000 Federals had arrived in the general area of Catherine Furnace.
That left a huge gap in the very center of the Union line, didn't it?
Absolutely. Sickles' troops captured the 23rd Georgia almost to a man. They viewed their activity here as a success. But what they didn't know was that 20,000 troops provided everything that was in support of General Howard's corps on the far right flank of the Union Army. At the very moment that Sickles' troops were victorious here at Catherine Furnace, Jackson's 26,000 troops were deploying in the wilderness west of Howard's right flank, ready to make their famous flank attack.
Make a famous flank attack against a completely unsupported Union Corps.
And this was going to contribute to the remarkable degree of success that Jackson would experience on the afternoon of May 2nd.
Jackson's flanking column on May 2nd consisted of 3 divisions, all under Virginians. Almost half of the force was the double-sized division of General A.P. Hill, a Culpeper native whose gallantry had extended from Williamsburg on the peninsula to Cedar Mountain in the Piedmont to saving Lee's army from a war-ending defeat at Antietam. Hill was 37, thin, with long auburn hair and flashing hazel eyes. He was proud, impetuous, and hard-fighting. Much of his effectiveness had been impaired of late by an ongoing feud with his superior, Stonewall Jackson. The division in the middle of the marching column was under Robert E. Colston. He too was 37, and a VMI graduate who had remained at the school to teach French, history, and military strategy. Jackson had a high opinion of his former faculty colleague. Promotions came quickly. This is somewhat strange, given Colston's highly limited field experience. Leading the flank march were the soldiers of Robert E. Rhodes. A native of Lynchburg, the 34-year-old Rhodes had returned to Lexington to teach mathematics at his alma mater. He rapidly became one of the best division commanders in all the Confederate armies, and he would die, as he might wish, in the field. Just before the charge at Chancellorsville, Jackson turned and looked at the officers clustered around him. 17 division leaders, brigadiers, and regimental colonels were VMI graduates. With emotion in his voice, Jackson said, "The Institute will be heard from today." For Jackson's 28,000 men, the march that May 2nd was indeed fatiguing. The soldiers were marching four abreast in route step. By Jackson's strict orders, they marched 50 minutes, rested 10, marched 50, rested 10. Initially, in the enthusiasm of the movement, some of the men talked. There was a little singing now and then. But as the hours passed and the heat and the humidity grew, silence took over the ranks, and before long only the clank of canteens against musket butts could be heard as the long line snaked its way through the wilderness for a rendezvous near Chancellorsville.
This is a vestige of one of the woods roads that Stonewall Jackson's column followed on May 2nd, 1863 during their famous flank march at Chancellorsville. A picture of this road is worth 10,000 words in a history book as to the logistical challenge Stonewall Jackson faced in moving his 15 brigades of infantry and more than 100 pieces of artillery on a march that would eventually consume 12 miles and do so secretly and preserve enough energy in his troops to allow them to make a flank attack at the end of this march. Jackson arranged his three divisions with General Rhodes's division in the lead, followed by the artillery, and then followed by Colston's division and A.P. Hill's division. When Jackson reached his deployment west of the right flank of the Union Army, only 10 of his 15 brigades would be in position. Nevertheless, more than 17,000 Confederates would be ready and poised to make one of the most famous attacks in American military history. Behind me, Virginia Route 3 traverses the historic trace of the Orange Turnpike. Of the 8,600 men of General Oliver Otis Howard's 11th Corps deployed on the Union right flank here, 8,000 of them faced south, 90 degrees away from the direction that Jackson's flank attack was about to begin. The other 600 troops were deployed about a half a mile in front of me with two small pieces of artillery, facing more than 26,000 Confederate troops, who at 5 p.m. responded to a bugle call signaled by Stonewall Jackson. The forest erupted with small animals, rabbits, squirrels, deer, who were fleeing from these thousands of Confederates driving through what was then a much more heavily wooded terrain than you see today. The two small Union regiments fired one volley and were quickly overrun, as were the remainder of Charles Devin's division located on Howard's right flank. About a half a mile behind me, however, a second Union division, commanded by Carl Schurz, wheeled 90 degrees and occupied a ridge above the Wilderness Church, holding off Jackson's attack, which extended 3/4 of a mile on either side of the Orange Turnpike for nearly half an hour, until Jackson's overwhelming force outflanked Schurz's men both on the left and right. The 11th Corps made yet a fourth stand about a quarter mile east of Wilderness Church, the so-called Bushbeck Line, until those Federals also were driven from the field. In a 2-hour span from about 5 o'clock until 7 o'clock, Jackson was successful in eliminating the entire 11th Corps from the field. However, the 11th Corps put up a sufficient fight, in fact it cost them 2,400 casualties, to so disorganize Jackson's first 2 divisions that Stonewall, who was desiring to continue the advantage gained by his flank attack, had to halt the progress of his corps until he could bring up the troops of A.P. Hill's division to continue the assault after dark. These orders would lead to tragic consequences in the thickness of the woods around Chancellorsville at 9 p.m.
Darkness had descended over the land that Saturday. Battle always ended with the setting of the sun. But Jackson was oblivious to the hour. Simple victory over the Federals was not enough. This was Armageddon. One more attack would bring total destruction of the Amalekites. A night assault was imperative, Jackson concluded. Without consulting Lee, disregarding both military custom and common sense, Jackson personally rode through the dark, smoke-filled woods where scattered firing was still taking place. Only his staff accompanied him as he sought to determine the exact position of the Union lines. Once satisfied as to the location of the enemy, Jackson turned his horse and started back, but to a different point in his lines. Confederate soldiers in that sector were unaware that their commander was reconnoitering in front. The Southerners first heard and then saw horsemen coming from the direction of the Union Army. They had to be enemy cavalry. Veteran Confederates needed no orders as to what to do. Men in the 18th North Carolina opened fire at a distance of some 75 yards. 3 69 caliber bullets struck the general. Somehow Jackson managed to stay in the saddle until aides could lift him tenderly to the ground. In a single blinding flash of gunfire, the man who was the chief hope of the Confederacy was suddenly out of the picture. For how long? The shooting of Jackson occurred about 9:15 p.m. 2 of the 3 bullet wounds were not serious, but the third was crippling. A bullet had entered the left arm 3 inches below the shoulder, splintered the bone, and torn surrounding tendons before passing out of the limb. An officer applied a makeshift tourniquet to stem heavy bleeding. Other aides galloped off in search of a physician and an ambulance. 2 soldiers lifted Jackson by the armpits and sought to take him to the rear. It was too painful. A litter team eventually arrived and placed Jackson on a canvas stretcher. Twice amid darkness, gunfire, and confusion, a litter bearer tripped. Both times Jackson fell heavily to the ground. By the time an ambulance was secured, Jackson was hemorrhaging, weak, displaying signs of shock. That was his condition when the general surgeon, Dr. Hunter McGuire, got to him. For mile after mile, the ambulance wagon bumped back and forth on the way to the temporary medical station at the Wilderness Tavern. It then took a while to get Jackson's condition stabilized. It had been 5 traumatic hours since the wounding, plus the fact that the general had been awake and active for fully 24 hours. This is all that remains of the Wilderness Tavern, which then stood along the Orange Plank Road. It now is beside a very busy Virginia Route 3. Here, 5 miles west of Chancellorsville, thousands of wounded Confederate soldiers were brought and laid out in the fields in available homes. It was here at 11 p.m. on May 2nd that the badly injured Stonewall Jackson was brought. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, 27-year-old Surgeon Hunter McGuire, assisted by 3 other physicians, amputated the mangled arm of the general. The following day, on learning of the general's misfortune, Lee sent a message: "You have lost your left arm, but I have lost my right." A favorite question in Civil War trivia contests is, what famous American is buried in 2 different places? The answer begins with 2 highly Christian staff officers who were not going to let the amputated limb of their beloved chief lie discarded on a pile of other severed limbs. What happened then, Will?
We're standing in the family cemetery of the Elwood Plantation. And this plantation during the war was owned by a man named J. Horace Lacey. Lacey's brother, Beverly Tucker Lacey, was Jackson's chaplain. And because Beverly Tucker Lacey was aware of his brother's family burying ground, he and young James Power Smith, a Presbyterian divinity student, wrapped Jackson's severed arm in a towel, trekked over a small rise about a half a mile, and quietly, unceremoniously gave Jackson's left arm a Christian burial at this family cemetery. Some 40 years later, James Power Smith, who by then had been the Presbyterian minister at the Fredericksburg Church and had married Lacey's daughter, came back and erected this small monument testifying to his commander's left arm.
And so the arm lies here on the hillside near the Chancellorsville battlefield. Jackson's body lies in Stonewall Jackson Cemetery across the Blue Ridge Mountains in Lexington.
When Lee learned of Jackson's serious wounding, he had to put someone else in command of the old Second Corps, and quickly. One of Jackson's subordinate division commanders might have seemed the logical choice, but the senior man, General A.P. Hill, was also wounded and out of action. Jubal Early was back at Fredericksburg facing Sedgwick, and none of the remainder had the experience to command such a large force in action. Instead, in the emergency, Lee turned to his trusted friend, Major General Jeb Stuart. The dashing Virginian had commanded the Army's cavalry troops for almost a year, and in recent months repeatedly showed himself a capable and dependable leader. Hooker's own cavalry scarcely participated in the battle, which relieved the pressure on Stuart, allowing Lee to temporarily move him away from his own command. That suited Stuart just fine, for he coveted leadership of an infantry corps with its greater responsibility. He would not disappoint Lee at Chancellorsville. Even though Jackson had made the dramatic movement that would eventually decide the battle, still there was much danger facing the Confederates, and it remained to be seen if they could reap the fruits of what Jackson had commenced. There would be a lot more hard fighting ahead to determine that outcome, and one thing Stuart could always promise Lee was that he was a bold and determined combatant. Nevertheless, if Hooker stood his ground, Lee and Stuart would still be separated by a strong force of Federals between them, with Sedgwick always a potential promise of disaster from their rear. For Robert E. Lee, a man who lived with being the underdog on a daily basis, it was perhaps the most dangerous moment of the battle.
Stonewall Jackson's flank attack on May 2nd had damaged the Union Army, but it had not destroyed it. The bulk of the Union Army still lay in position, a very strong position, and was ready to fight the Confederates the next day. In fact, the irony is that Stonewall Jackson's attack had actually put the Confederates in a worse position because now their outnumbered army was divided and Joe Hooker held the key ground in between, the ground known as Hazel Grove. However, Hooker made a big mistake by evacuating Hazel Grove, thereby allowing Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson's corps, now commanded by the cavalryman, Jeb Stuart, to reunite the wings of their army. On May 3rd, Jeb Stuart seized Hazel Grove, massed about 30 guns there, and began pounding the center of the Union position here at Fairview. The Federals had roughly 40 to 45 guns here on this ridge, and they now began to reply to that fire. But at the same time, they came under artillery fire from the west, and also more artillery fire from the east. So the Federals here were caught in a three-way crossfire. After 4 hours of punishment, the Federals finally gave up this hill and fell back to Chancellorsville, and from there retreated to the river. The Battle of Chancellorsville was now well on its way to being won.
It is ironic that after all the marches and all the maneuvering, what decided the Battle of Chancellorsville was artillery. On the morning of May 3rd, General Hooker pulled back his troops from this high ground at Hazel Grove to beyond the tree line in my rear to Chancellorsville intersection. Southerners quickly swarmed over this area, saw immediately the advantages it offered for artillery, and quickly placed guns up here. The Confederates opened a deadly flank fire into the Union position at Chancellorsville. It was such a one-sided contest that some authorities have called it the greatest day for artillery in the history of the Army of Northern Virginia. Hooker inherited an army of 7 corps, led by veteran officers of highly varying abilities. Some of them were conspicuous in the Chancellorsville campaign. Darius N. Couch led the 2nd Corps and was Hooker's second in command. Couch was unimposing, a slight, weak-looking professional soldier who in the Mexican War had won much reputation and lost much of his health. Cool and cautious were his attributes. In striking contrast to Couch was the 3rd Corps' Daniel Lee Sickles. He was a Tammany Hall politician who got a general's appointment through political pull rather than from any military talents. Sickles was gallant but bombastic, impetuous and unpredictable. One observer noted, whether Sickles was drinking, fighting, winching, or plotting, he was always operating with the throttle wide open. Tall, spare, and stooped George Gordon Meade led the 5th Corps and ultimately would be the last commander of the Army of the Potomac. Meade was steady to the point of dullness, yet he was a solid general, totally void of the ambition that compromised so many of his fellow officers. However, Meade possessed such an uncontrollable temper that Billy Yanks usually referred to him as a damned old goggle-eyed snapping turtle. Oliver O. Howard led the 11th Corps that Jackson sent fleeing in near panic at Chancellorsville. A Maine officer of consuming religious ideals, Howard was a paradox in the Union High Command. One general said, "No general entrusted with the field direction of soldiers ever equaled Howard's record for surviving so many tactical errors of judgment and disregard of orders, emerging later with increased rank." Chancellorsville would be the darkest of Howard's many dark days in the field. The other wing of the Union Army was at Fredericksburg and under the 6th Corps' John Sedgwick. This Connecticut native was an affable, scrubby, bearded bachelor who played solitaire in his tent when not displaying a methodical and resolute leadership in battle. Scrupulous attention to the needs of his men had brought Sedgwick the nickname Uncle John. Still, Sedgwick was never known for daring decisions or rapid movements.
In Fredericksburg, some 10 miles away, the sounds of battle between Lee and Hooker had been heard since the first gun was fired, yet neither of the commanders there had definite information about the course of the battle around Chancellorsville. At least Sedgwick had a good idea of what the opponent in his immediate front was doing. Thaddeus Lowe, commanding the Yankees' observation balloons, made repeated ascensions, leading one soldier to say that Lowe and his assistants were up and down like jumping jacks. What they saw of Early's positions and movements was of great importance as Sedgwick planned his final assault to take the city.
Knowing that he'd given up his initiative when he lost his confidence in himself, Hooker looked to Sedgwick to retrieve the situation. On May 2nd, he'd sent a peremptory order for Sedgwick to take Fredericksburg immediately and push Early hard before him. Sedgwick launched the first of several assaults on the heights protecting the town on the morning of May 3rd. As one was repulsed, he sent forward another and yet another. Finally sensing that the Confederate line was too weak to withstand any more shock, Sedgwick sent forward a massive bayonet assault. It pushed through Early's lines and forced him to pull his command back to the outskirts of town and then even farther south. The road to Chancellorsville and Lee's rear was open. The Yankees pushed forward as fast as they could, but found progress slow. Still, after some hours, Sedgwick had advanced to within just 6 miles of Chancellorsville. But word of Early's retreat had reached Lee not long after Hooker himself fell back from Hazel Grove. Confident now that the enemy in his front was no longer a potent danger, Lee took the chance of sending 2 of his own divisions back to stop Sedgwick. When the Yankees reached Salem Church, they found Confederate Lafayette McLaws in a strong position on high ground. They hurled themselves at the Confederate line, but it held. Then McLaws counterattacked, stopping the Yankees cold. By the next morning, Early brought most of his command to join McLaws. Together, they prepared to launch their own attack. By then, however, knowing himself stymied and Hooker defeated, Sedgwick had retired from the field. The battle at Chancellorsville was over.
The building behind me, Salem Church, still bears the marks of the 1863 Battle of Chancellorsville. Salem Church still remains to remind us of what happened here in May of 1863, but unfortunately, the rest of the battlefield has pretty well been destroyed. Over the course of the last, 30 or 40 years, development has swept over this area and has turned what was once peaceful fields and woods into shopping centers, subdivisions, and malls. It's the goal of the National Park Service to try to preserve areas like Salem Church so that Americans don't forget about their historical past.
Salem Church was a landmark in the fighting of May 3rd and 4th. It was also the scene of another picture, one quite common in Civil War battles, but one not usually found in the history books. This Baptist sanctuary became a makeshift field hospital for the hundreds upon hundreds of mangled young men of North and South. A day or so after the battle, Colonel Robert McMillan of the 24th Georgia came here in search of friends. The colonel was appalled by what he saw. This is what he wrote. The sight inside the building for horror was perhaps never equaled within so limited a space. Every available foot of space was crowded with wounded and bleeding soldiers. The floor, the benches, even the chancel and pulpit were all packed almost to suffocation with soldiers. The amputated limbs were piled up in every corner almost as high as a man could reach. Blood flowed in streams along the aisles and out at the doors. Screams and groans were heard on all sides. This, too, was part of the Chancellorsville campaign. Assailed from the east, south, and west by Confederate forces, Sedgwick's portion of Hooker's army retreated northward and crossed the Rappahannock at Banks Ford, the rock line you see behind me. Lee then turned and headed back to Chancellorsville to finish off Hooker, only to find when he got there that Hooker, too, had utilized the fords to make his escape back across the river to safety. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Lincoln read dispatches from the battlefield of the terrible defeat, and all the president could say was, "My God, what will the country say?"
If ever Robert E. Lee breathed a sigh of relief, it had to be after the fighting stopped around Chancellorsville. On May 6th, Hooker retreated, and once more Lee had beaten the odds. Against numbers exceeding 2-1, he'd driven back the Army of the Potomac and perhaps saved Richmond. It came at a heavy cost, however. About 13,000 casualties, more than 20% of his command. Then there was the serious wounding of Stonewall Jackson, an event whose outcome was yet uncertain as Lee's outpost watched the Yankees recross the Rappahannock. But Lee always thought ahead, and now realities and possibilities confronted him. The enemy was beaten and presumably demoralized. The season for active campaigning had just begun. Surely Lincoln would find another general, and the Yankees would come again. Lee had to seize the moment, call in General James Longstreet's corps and other units, and renew his army's strength. This was the time to strike before the enemy could recover, the time to push northward to the Potomac and take the war to the enemy. For the bold, the fields of Maryland, even Pennsylvania, lay ahead.
Jackson needed post-surgery rest and quiet, but the stay at the Wilderness Tavern Field Hospital lasted only a day. Lee became increasingly concerned. The battle was still storming. The lines were unstable. Lee wanted his best general far away in a safe place. The site selected was Guinea Station. It was south of Fredericksburg and on the railhead of the Richmond-Fredericksburg and Potomac Railroad. From there, Jackson could be moved speedily and in several directions if necessary. Surgeon McGuire was pleased with Jackson's physical condition after surgery, and he too favored the move to Guinea Station. On a hot Monday, May 4th, the general was placed on a mattress inside a wagon. A tortuous 27-mile trip began. Jackson was alert and talkative in the early stages of the 14-hour ride. Yet as the temperature climbed and the wagon pitched and bounced, the general began to experience both nausea and pain in his side. All along the route, people rushed to the ambulance with food and tearful eyes. Others, soldiers and civilians alike, bowed their heads and prayed silently as the wagon passed. Rain was falling through the twilight when the long journey ended at the Chandler Estate a few hundred feet north of Guinea Station. Jackson by then was exhausted. The trip to safety had strapped much of what strength he had left. However, the general knew that his wife Anna was only 55 miles down the railroad at Richmond. She would come soon and help nurse him back to health. All was well.
This is the Fairfield plantation of Thomas Coleman Chandler. He owned about 860 acres surrounding us. Stonewall Jackson was brought here on the evening of May 4th, 1863 at about 8 p.m. Jackson was supposed to stay in Mr. Chandler's house, a large brick affair, but the doctors were rather stunned to learn that the house was already packed with wounded before the general arrived. Dr. Hunter Holmes McGuire, Jackson's medical director, went through the house and examined each of the patients very carefully. Inside, he discovered that one of the patients was suffering from erysipelas, a strep disease which was highly infectious and often lethal. With nowhere else to turn and thunderstorms starting to roll in, they had to improvise quickly. Dr. McGuire asked about this little clapboard building and learned that it was only the office on the plantation. Since nobody was staying there, Dr. McGuire immediately commandeered it. People raced out into the yard and dragged off the office furniture, desks and files, workbenches and tools, and quickly replaced them with any kind of house furniture available. They converted this small office into a cottage. This became Jackson's final home. This is the room where Stonewall Jackson was brought on the evening of May 4th, 1863. Once he was brought into this room, he never left this room alive. He spent the last 6 days of his life here.
In 2 years, his flame flashed across the Southern Confederacy, soared over the land of his enemies, and traveled even beyond the seas. The Commander-in-Chief of the British armies would declare, "In my opinion, Stonewall Jackson was the greatest natural military genius the world ever saw. I will go even further than that. As a campaigner in the field, he never had a superior. In some respects, I doubt whether he ever had an equal." Jackson was the paladin in the opening battle of the war at Manassas. One setback after another then befell the Confederate States. The Southern people were desperate for a victory when, suddenly in the spring of 1862, Jackson electrified the world with his campaign in the Valley of Virginia. Thereafter, he was the most esteemed and beloved general in the Confederacy. There was something else. To attempt to portray the life of Jackson, a Richmond minister asserted, while leaving out the religious element, would be like undertaking to describe Switzerland without making mention of the Alps. Jackson's brilliance as a general and his piety as a man made him a perfect soldier for the Southern people. His passing at a high point in Confederate success was the greatest personal loss suffered by the wartime South. For generations thereafter, Southerners and many Northerners as well would say that had Jackson lived, the Confederate quest for independence would have succeeded. Rarely, if ever in history, has so much influence been vested in one individual.
The doctors examined Jackson on the morning of May 10th very early, and they immediately realized that Jackson was beyond hope. They took Mrs. Jackson out of this room and informed her that her husband would not survive the day, but they were reluctant to tell Jackson himself. When Mariana realized that the doctors weren't going to tell her husband, she came in here and broke the news to him. She handled it in a remarkable fashion, actually kneeling beside her husband's bed and breaking the news by posing it as a question, asking if it was the will of Jackson's father to be with him that day. Would he acquiesce? After repeating the question several times, Jackson answered in a feeble voice, "I'd prefer it." Later on, Jackson asked to see Dr. McGuire, and he asked him pointedly, "Anna tells me I'm to die this day. Is that so?" When the doctor affirmed that the end was near, Jackson relaxed. He actually smiled at everyone in the room and simply answered, "Good, that's good, it's all right." In that instant, Jackson not only understood, but he accepted, and perhaps we can make a case he even embraced the end. Later on, when he was alone with one staff officer, he told them that his desire through life was that when he died, he wished to die on the Sabbath. May 10th was in fact a Sunday. Jackson set himself one last goal before the end. He desired to keep his mind sharp as close to the end as possible, fighting off the fever of pneumonia, fighting off even the painkillers that they had been giving him, heavy doses of laudanum, which was a tincture of opium and an alcohol derivative. Jackson refused to take the painkillers on the last day. But even with his best efforts, Jackson continually lapsed in and out of reality. Often, he would go back to the battlefields and start reliving them, issuing the orders as he had the night he was wounded. About an hour, maybe an hour and a half before the end, Jackson slipped entirely into delirium and didn't return. He started to ramble quite a bit, talking very freely, sometimes booming at the top of his lungs, other times barely audible as a whisper. According to the doctors and Mrs. Jackson and some of the staff officers present, Jackson was literally reliving the last 2 years of his life. They could pick out the distinct moments from his past based on what he was saying here. They recognized anything from a simple dinner conversation with the mess to evening prayers with staff officers. quiet moments with Mrs. Jackson. But all the scenes came back to that one point, the Battle of Chancellorsville. And at those moments, Jackson would become very animated. He'd start shouting commands at the top of his lungs, calling on various officers like General A.P. Hill to press forward Hill, cut them off from the U.S. ford, pass the infantry to the fore. He was calling on various staff officers, some of these young men right around his bed, like his chief of staff, Sandy Pendleton. Jackson often called on him, had Pendleton see to it, had Pendleton take care of that. At one point, Jackson became very upset and shouted out, "Where is Pendleton?" Then he relaxed. "Ah, Pendleton, I want you to see if there's any high ground between us and the river." Now, as he worked his way through a litany of staff officers, Jackson became very worked up, very impatient, until he snapped for his commissary officer, Wells Hawks, shouting, "Tell Major Hawks to..." But he broke off in mid-sentence. At that moment, Jackson completely relaxed. He sank back in his bed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he smiled. It was a particularly striking smile. Dr. McGuire said it was a smile of ineffable sweetness. In a very light voice, Jackson whispered, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." And then he was gone.
At Chancellorsville, Lee took incredible chances against heavy odds. In a week's time, however, he so changed the military situation that the Army of the Potomac did not again undertake a march on Richmond for a full year. Chancellorsville was, by all perspective, Lee's most stunning victory. Yet it came at a terrible cost. 13,000 casualties, including 1,700 killed, and one of those fatalities was Stonewall Jackson. "I know not how to replace him," a grieving Lee confessed. Hardened soldiers wept openly. One private exclaimed, "Everyone felt as though he had lost one of his dearest friends." The Richmond Daily Dispatch stated, "The affections of every household in the nation were twined about this great and unselfish warrior, who 2 years ago was an unknown man. He has fallen, and the nation weeps." The loss of Jackson marked a pronounced line of demarcation in the annals of the Army of Northern Virginia. Delegation of authority, permitting the widest degree of latitude, had been the basis of Lee's great triumphs during the 11 months that Jackson was with him. At Gettysburg, with Jackson only 7 weeks in the grave, the system would fail Lee. No other executive officer had the ability of old Jack. No great tactician was there to shout, press on," as Jackson had done in the Valley, at Second Manassas, and at Chancellorsville. In Pennsylvania, Lee saw that he had to do it all himself, and it did not work. The price of victory at Chancellorsville may have been the cost of defeat at Gettysburg. Something else happened because of Chancellorsville. Since there was not, and never would be, a replacement for Jackson, Lee never again attempted the spectacular dividing of his army that he had risked not once, but 5 times with Jackson taking the lead. What Jackson brought to the outmanned Confederate Army was incredible mobility. His swift, secret marches, his sudden appearances, his heavy attacks kept the huge, well-equipped Union Army continually off balance and unsure. Although outnumbered, Lee had Jackson. The commander could feint and jab and thrust until he left an opponent bloodied and beaten. A year after Chancellorsville, the 2 opposing armies met again in the same woods. Lee then had no mobility, no man to execute surprise to perfection. And this forced Lee to wage the kind of war he did not want, a stand-up, slug-it-out contest with a superior foe. It was the kind of fight Robert E. Lee could not win over the long haul. Thus, in more ways than one for the Confederate States, the journey to Appomattox may well have begun on a Saturday night when a sheet of gunfire swept through the darkness at a place called Chancellorsville.